I woke to the sound of my name, or at least, that's what I thought. The room was still, the kind of heavy quiet that settles deep in the desert at night. Moonlight bled through the curtains, casting long shadows across the floor. Then I heard it again. A whisper. But not my name. Michael. For a long moment I didn't move. Didn't breathe. Just stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of that name settle into my bones like a slow, cold wind. I turned my head slightly. Naomi was on her side, fast asleep, her breath steady. Maybe I'd misheard. Maybe I hadn't. I lay there, staring into the dark, a dull heat spreading through my chest, not from anger, not yet, but from understanding. It wasn't a question. It wasn't some mistake. It was truth slipping out in the one place she couldn't control it. At dawn, I got up as I always did, put on coffee, and stepped outside. The air was crisp, the ground cool beneath my boots. The desert stretched before me, endless and quiet. I'd spent most of my life out here, guiding men who got lost in these sands, teaching them how to read the land, how to survive. Some men got careless, thinking they knew better than the desert. They usually ended up bones bleaching in the sun. I never saw much difference between nature and people. Both could be cruel. Both could lie to you. And both always showed their truth if you knew where to look. Inside, Naomi moved through the kitchen like nothing had changed, hair tied back, sleeves rolled up as she rinsed out her coffee mug. "You're up early," she said, voice smooth, practiced. I took a sip from my own mug. "I always am." She gave a little laugh, the kind that was meant to smooth over whatever tension she sensed. "Right? Creature of habit." I watched her, the small things I might not have noticed before. The way her hands lingered against the counter. The way her eyes didn't quite meet mine when she asked, "Something wrong?" "No," I set my cup down. "Why would there be?" She hesitated just a fraction before giving a soft shrug. "I don't know. You seem distant." That almost made me laugh. Distant. Right? Like she hadn't already left in some way, like part of her hadn't slipped away in the dead of night and whispered another man's name. I didn't press her. Not yet. Instead, I went about my day as usual, saddled up my truck, checked my supplies, made my rounds at the outpost. But in the back of my mind, something was shifting. A door had opened, and once you saw the truth, there was no unseeing it. Later that afternoon, I ran into Marcus, the neighbor's kid, scrappy and full of too much energy for his small frame. He was crouched near my fence, messing with something in the dirt. "You diggin' for gold?" I asked. He looked up, grinning. "Nah. Found a cool lizard. Want to see?" I nodded, crouching down as he lifted a flat rock, revealing a scurrying brown creature underneath. "Nice find," I said. "Yeah, they're real fast. Gotta be careful though, they bite." He glanced up at me. "Hey, I saw Dr. Mike here again yesterday. He's at your house a lot." I felt my jaw tighten, but I didn't let it show. "Dr. Mike? So it wasn't just a dream." "Oh yeah?" I said, keeping my tone light. "What was he doing?" "Dunno. Just saw his car. He always leaves real quick though." I patted Marcus's shoulder. "Good to know, kid. Try not to get bit." I walked away slow, my mind already turning. Michael Parker. Therapist. Polished. The kind of man who always had the right words, always knew what to say to make people feel safe. Naomi had started seeing him after her sister died last year. It helps, she'd said, to talk to someone. I hadn't argued. I knew grief had a way of sinking its teeth into people, dragging them down where no one could reach them. I thought it was helping her. Maybe it had for a while. By evening, I had my answer. Thomas Jacobs, the private investigator, picked up on the first ring. "Archer. Long time. Need a favor," I said. "All right. What kind?" "The kind you don't talk about." There was a pause. Then, a low chuckle. "Thought you'd never ask." A few days later, I met Thomas in a small diner just off the highway. The place smelled like burnt coffee and old grease, and the waitress looked like she'd been there since the place opened 30 years ago. It was the kind of spot where people came and went without much notice, which was exactly why I picked it. Thomas was already there, leaning back in the booth, stirring sugar into his coffee like he didn't have a care in the world. "You look like hell," he said as I slid into the seat across from him. I ignored that. "You got something for me?" He reached into his coat and slid a plain manila envelope across the table. "Plenty." I didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, I lifted my coffee, took a slow sip, and met his eyes. "Give me the short version." Thomas exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "She's been seeing him for at least 3 months, maybe more. Meetings at a motel on the outskirts of Tucson, always the same routine. She arrives first, he follows. Never stays more than an hour. They're careful, but not careful enough." He tapped the envelope. I got timestamps, photos, even a couple of phone logs. "She's been calling him late at night. Real intimate conversations if the patterns mean anything. I ran a thumb along the edge of the envelope, feeling the weight of it. Not just paper. Not just ink. Proof. Thomas studied me for a beat, then leaned forward, lowering his voice. You sure you want to go through with this? Some guys, they think they want the truth, but when they get it. I'm not some guy, I said, voice steady. I don't look away. He smirked. Didn't think you did? I left the diner without opening the envelope. Drove home through the long stretch of desert highway, the sky a deep orange fading into black. The photos didn't matter. I already knew. But there was something final about seeing it with your own eyes, something that made it real in a way nothing else could. When I pulled into the driveway, Naomi's car was already there. Inside, the house smelled like dinner, something with garlic and onions, rich and warm. She looked up from the stove as I walked in, giving me a small smile. Hey, you're home later than usual. Had things to do, I said, hanging my hat by the door. She stirred the pot, nodding like she was trying to act normal, like there wasn't something festering beneath the surface. Everything all right? I watched her for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. Yeah, everything's just fine. She didn't push. I sat at the table watching her move around the kitchen, the way she hummed softly under her breath, the way she wiped her hands on a towel like she'd done 1,000 times before. Normal. Routine. A lie wrapped up in something familiar. That night, I finally opened the envelope. The photos were crisp, clear. Naomi stepping out of her car. Michael following minutes later. The motel sign glowing dimly in the background. There was even one of them in the lot, close enough to see the way he looked at her, the way she leaned into him like he was the only solid thing in the world. I set the photos down and exhaled slowly, pressing my fingers to my temples. I wasn't angry. Not in the way most men would be. No yelling, no fists through walls. Just a cold, sinking weight in my gut. The way you feel when a storm's rolling in and you know there's not a damn thing you can do to stop it. The next morning I made coffee, same as always. Sat on the porch, watching the horizon while the desert stretched out before me, unbothered, untouched. Naomi came out a few minutes later, mug in hand. You've been quiet lately, she said, testing the waters. I took a slow sip. Have I? She hesitated, then forced a little laugh. Yeah. Feels like you're a million miles away. I set my cup down and looked at her, really looked at her. For a second I almost saw the woman I married, the one who used to laugh with her whole body, who used to look at me like I was something steady. But that woman wasn't here anymore. I smiled, slow and measured. I'm right where I need to be. Something flickered across her face, something uncertain. She didn't know yet, but she could feel it. The shift. The tide turning. I let it sit there between us, let her feel the weight of it. Then I picked up my coffee, took another sip and turned back to the desert like I didn't have a care in the world. A week passed. I kept my routine the same, woke up early, made coffee, checked my gear, went out to the outpost, helped a few tourists who thought they could handle the desert without knowing a damn thing about it. Kept my head level, my tone easy. If Naomi noticed anything off, she didn't say it. Maybe she thought she was in the clear. Maybe she told herself I was too wrapped up in my own world to suspect a thing. Either way, she started slipping. One night, she took extra care getting ready before heading out. Light makeup, simple earrings, hair just a little too perfect for someone who was supposedly meeting a friend for a late dinner. She stood by the mirror adjusting her blouse. I might be home late, she said, glancing at me in the reflection. Don't wait up. I didn't even look up from my book. Wouldn't dream of it. She hesitated like she was waiting for something, maybe a sign of jealousy, maybe even anger. She got nothing. Just the sound of pages turning. She walked out, shutting the door behind her, and I sat there for a long moment, listening to the silence she left behind. Then I stood, grabbed my keys, and left through the back. I took the long way into town, the kind of back roads tourists never saw, where the desert swallowed everything and the only lights came from the moon and the occasional flicker of Archer Rabbit's eyes in the brush. When I pulled into the lot of the Silver Spur Motel, Thomas was already there, leaning against his truck, cigarette dangling from his fingers. He flicked his chin toward the second-floor walkway. She's up there. Room 214. I nodded, slipping my hands into my pockets. How long? 15 minutes. Loverboy showed up right after. I let out a slow breath, watching the glow of a neon vacancy sign flicker in the window. The motel was the kind of place you used when you didn't want to be seen, cheap, quiet, tucked away behind a truck stop. I stepped past Thomas, took my time walking up the stairs. When I reached their door, I stood there for a moment, listening. Muffled voices. Soft laughter. Then silence. I knocked. The laughter stopped. A beat of hesitation, then Naomi's voice, light and controlled. Who is it? Room service, I said. A pause. A click of heels against the floor. The door cracked open an inch, just enough for her to peek out. When she saw me, her face went pale. "Archer." I pushed the door open and stepped inside. Michael was sitting at the edge of the bed, buttoning his shirt, his face a perfect mix of shock and panic. Naomi was frozen, one hand gripping the doorknob like it was the only thing keeping her upright. I let my gaze drift over the room, cheap floral curtains, a half-empty bottle of wine on the nightstand, 2 glasses. No point pretending. Michael cleared his throat, standing slowly. "Look, I held up a hand. "Don't bother." I wasn't interested in whatever excuse was forming behind those nervous eyes. Instead, I turned to Naomi. "You got anything you want to say?" She opened her mouth, then closed it. Looked at me, then at Michael like she was trying to piece together some way out of this. "Archer, No," I said, shaking my head. "I don't need to hear it." I wasn't going to give her that chance. No begging, no explanations, no lies dressed up as regret. I pulled a folded piece of paper from my pocket and tossed it onto the nightstand. "That's the lawyer's number. Papers are ready. You'll find another place to stay by the weekend." She blinked like she hadn't fully processed what was happening. "You're serious?" I smiled. "Dead serious." Michael shifted, glancing between us. "Look, this doesn't have to get ugly." I turned to him then, let my gaze settle on him the way I would a man lost in the desert who didn't know how bad off he was yet. "It's already ugly. You just don't know it." His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. Naomi stepped forward, her voice sharper now, trying to find footing. "So that's it? You're just walking away?" I tilted my head. "What else is there?" She opened her mouth, but no words came. There weren't any left. I let the silence stretch, then turned and walked out, shutting the door behind me. The air outside was cool, the sky wide and dark, stars stretching forever. Thomas was still leaning against his truck, watching me with that same unreadable expression. "Well," he said. I climbed into my truck, started the engine, and let out a slow breath. "She can have him." Thomas smirked. "Cold." I put the truck in gear. "Fair." And with that I drove off, leaving the motel and everything inside it behind. Naomi didn't take long to realize I wasn't bluffing. The next morning, she tried to play it off, acting like she still had some control over the situation. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, stirring cream into her coffee, slow and methodical, like she was measuring her words. "You really went and hired a lawyer?" Her voice was careful, steady, testing the waters. I sipped my own coffee, eyes on the desert outside. "That's what I said." She let out a short laugh, shaking her head. "Just like that." I finally looked at her. "What did you expect?" Her fingers tightened around the mug. "I don't know. Maybe a conversation." Maybe she stopped herself, choosing her next words carefully. "Maybe a little more emotion." I smiled, slow and deliberate. "That's the difference between us, Ev. I don't waste time pretending something's worth saving when it's already dead." She exhaled sharply through her nose. "You think you're punishing me? You think walking away without a fight makes you the bigger man?" I set my cup down, letting the silence stretch. She didn't like that. Never had. Naomi had always needed a reaction, needed to pull something out of people, but I wasn't giving her that. Her voice softened. "Archer, I never wanted to hurt you." I nodded. "And yet, here we are." She looked down, lips pressing into a thin line. She wasn't used to this version of me, the one who wasn't playing into her hands, who wasn't yelling or pleading or making this easier by falling apart. The silence between us felt heavier than any argument could have. By that afternoon, she was calling Michael. I heard her in the other room, voice tight, strained. "I don't know, Mike. He's not reacting how I thought he would. It's like he doesn't even care." I stepped outside before I could hear more. Thomas called later that evening. "Thought you'd like an update." I leaned against my truck, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "Go on." Loverboy's practice is about to take a hit. Word's getting around about the affair. A couple of his big clients are pulling out. Turns out married men don't like trusting their problems to a guy who screws another man's wife. I exhaled through my nose, more amused than anything. "That's so." Thomas chuckled. "It gets better. Someone, probably not me, definitely not me, sent an anonymous tip to the medical board about some questionable ethics violations. Might take a few weeks, but he's got a rough road ahead." I let that settle. I hadn't asked for revenge, hadn't even needed it, but I wasn't about to lose sleep over Michael getting what was coming to him. "What about Naomi?" I asked. "She's been making calls. A lot of them. Sounds like she's realizing how fast things are slipping." He paused. "You sure you're done with her?" I glanced back at the house, at the dim glow of the kitchen window where I could see her silhouette pacing. "Yeah." Thomas was quiet for a beat. "Then you should probably know she tried to get ahead of the story." I frowned. "How?" "She met with her parents this afternoon." Spun them a real good one. Said you've been emotionally distant for years, implied you were slipping mentally. Said the affair wasn't really an affair, just a friendship she leaned on because you weren't there for her. I smirked. And they believed that? Thomas let out a low laugh. Not even close. I don't know what you did to earn their respect, but they weren't buying a word of it. If anything, she pissed them off. Her mother told her she should have come to them if she was having problems, not spread her legs for another man. I chuckled. That sounds like Clara. Yep. And here's the kicker, her dad cut her off financially. No more help with the mortgage. No more trust fund cushion. She's on her own. I ran a hand over my jaw, feeling the weight of it all settle in. It was funny in a way. Naomi had spent months thinking she had control, that she was making the decisions, that she was choosing something better. And now? Now she was standing in the middle of a mess of her own making, watching it all collapse. I didn't feel sorry for her. I did feel a sense of finality, though. Like the storm had passed and all that was left was the cleanup. Appreciate the update, I said. Thomas grunted. No problem. You need anything else? Nah. I think I got everything I need. I hung up, pocketed my phone, and walked back toward the house. Naomi was still pacing, still making frantic phone calls, still trying to stitch together the pieces of a life she'd already torn apart. I passed her in the hallway heading to the bedroom. She stopped mid-sentence, watching me. Archer. I paused, meeting her eyes. She swallowed. What happens now? I gave her a small, easy smile. You'll figure it out. Then I closed the door behind me and that was that. A month passed and life went on. Not for Naomi, though. For her, things had only started unraveling. Michael's practice took a hit worse than I expected. Turned out the affair wasn't his first misstep, just the one that finally pushed things over the edge. The ethics complaint Thomas definitely didn't send in gained traction, and patients started dropping him one after another. Nobody wanted to confide in a man who couldn't keep his own life in order. Naomi moved in with him at first, probably thinking they'd build something real now that she was free. That didn't last. 2 weeks in, Michael realized she came with more baggage than he signed up for. No financial cushion, no social standing, no safety net. Just a woman who had burned down her life for a man who never planned on holding up the roof. He ended things as politely as he could, but Naomi was left exactly where she feared most, alone, scrambling, and with nowhere to turn. I was sitting at the outpost one evening when Thomas called. Your ex has been making the rounds, he said, sounding more amused than anything. She reached out to a couple of old friends looking for a place to stay. No takers. I leaned back in my chair, watching the last light slip below the horizon. No surprise. She also tried to talk to your son. That made me sit up straighter. What? Relax. He didn't give her much. My jaw tightened anyway. I hadn't been a perfect father, but I'd raised my son to understand that some things weren't worth forgiving. Thomas exhaled through the phone. I'll give her credit, she's persistent. Seems to think if she can paint you as the cold bastard, she'll get someone to feel sorry for her. She's welcome to try. She's already failed. Thomas chuckled. Her parents still aren't speaking to her. Her father made it real clear she's on her own. Guess they had enough of her choices catching up to them. I didn't feel anything when I heard that. No satisfaction, no pity. Just the same quiet certainty I'd had the night I left her at that motel. Naomi had always played a game she thought she was too smart to lose. The problem was she wasn't as smart as she thought, and worse, she never knew when to quit. 2 days later, she showed up at my door. I heard her car pull in before I saw her, that familiar purr of the engine. She stepped out, dressed well but not quite put together, the way a person looks when they're trying to seem like they haven't lost control. I didn't say anything as she walked up the steps, stopping just shy of the door. She hesitated. Archer. I met her eyes, waiting. She exhaled sharply, shaking her head like she couldn't believe this was how it had come to this. Can we talk? I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. About what? Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. I just need to understand something. How can you be so, she searched for the word, unmoved? I let that sit between us for a moment. Because I made my peace with this a long time ago. She frowned. That's not possible. We were married, Archer. You can't just shut that off. I nodded slowly. You're right. But you did. That landed. She blinked, shifting slightly, wrapping her arms around herself like the air had turned cold. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I smirked. Funny thing about choices. They don't care what you meant. She let out a short, tired laugh, shaking her head. So that's it? You don't even care. I care, I said simply. Just not about you anymore. Her lips parted slightly, but whatever words she was about to say never made it out. Instead, she looked away, exhaling hard through her nose, hands gripping the railing beside her. I lost everything. I didn't respond. It wasn't a question, and it sure as hell wasn't my problem. She turned back to me, something desperate in her voice now. Archer, I made a mistake. I see that now. I should have. She stopped herself, took a shaky breath, then started over. If I could take it back, I would. I studied her for a long moment, then stepped back inside and started closing the door. She panicked, stepping forward. Archer, please, I stopped just long enough to meet her eyes. We're done here, Naomi. Then I shut the door. Naomi didn't knock again. I stood by the door for a few seconds, listening. She lingered on the porch, probably expecting me to open it back up to give her something: anger, pity, a second chance. When none of that came, she let out a breath, turned, and walked back to her car. I heard the door open, the pause before she got in, like she was still debating one last word, one last plea. Then the engine started, and just like that, she was gone. I didn't watch her leave. Didn't need to. I went back to my chair, poured another cup of coffee, and sat in the quiet. Some men would have chased after her, let her tears pull them back in, let the guilt take root. But guilt only works when you believe you did something wrong. I didn't. A week later, I ran into Thomas at the feed store. He was leaning against a stack of grain bags, flipping through a magazine like he had nowhere better to be. Your ex made another stop, he said without looking up. I grabbed a bag of feed, tossed it over my shoulder. Where? Michael's place. He finally looked at me, smirking. He didn't let her in. I huffed a quiet laugh. Figures. Heard she's looking for a job now. That was the part that almost surprised me. Naomi had never worked a real job in her life, never had to. She'd gone from her father's wallet to mine, smooth as glass. Now she had neither. What's she trying for? I asked. Thomas shrugged. Don't know. But I'll tell you this, her name's got some dirt on it now. Word travels fast in a town this size. Most folks don't like hiring a woman who blew up her own marriage and lost her safety net in the process. I didn't say anything, just shifted the feed bag higher on my shoulder. Thomas watched me for a second, then sighed. You ever gonna tell me how you stayed so damn calm through all this? I met his gaze. Easy. I saw it coming. He snorted. Yeah? And what gave it away? I thought about the first night I heard Michael's name slip past her lips in her sleep, the way she started leaving the house just a little more often, the way she thought she was 2 steps ahead when she'd been 6 steps behind the whole time. I shook my head. People always tell you who they are. Sooner or later. Thomas studied me, then nodded. Fair enough. By the time I got home, I had a voicemail from Naomi's father. Short. Direct. Archer, I just wanted to say you handled this like a real man. If you ever need anything, you know where to find me. That was all. No apology for raising her the way he did, no attempt to explain her actions. Just a quiet acknowledgement that, in the end, she'd been the one who lost the most. I deleted the message and stepped outside. The air smelled like rain coming in, the kind that wouldn't hit for a few more hours but still carried that sharp, electric edge. The kind of storm that only the desert knows how to deliver. I walked to the edge of my property, hands in my pockets, eyes on the horizon. It had been a long few months, but nothing had really changed. The desert was still the desert. The land still stretched out before me, indifferent, endless. It had no patience for weakness, no use for regret. Neither did I. I never saw Naomi again after that day. She tried for a while. A couple of texts that I didn't answer, a few calls I let ring out. Eventually, she got the message. Or maybe life forced her to. Last I heard, she was working the front desk at some real estate office in town, barely scraping by. No fancy vacations, no weekend getaways, no safety net to fall back on. Just a paycheck that barely covered the rent on a place that was nowhere near as nice as the one she walked out of. Michael? His practice never recovered. The ethics complaint stuck and the board eventually revoked his license. Turns out people lose trust in a man who spends more time screwing his patients than helping them. He packed up and left town not long after, trying to outrun the damage. Didn't matter. A reputation like that follows you. Thomas updated me every now and then, but I never asked. Didn't need to. I already knew how the story ended for them. The weak don't make it far, and the ones who think they're untouchable always fall the hardest. One evening, a few months later, I was at the outpost, checking supplies, when Marcus came running up, out of breath. Mr. Owens, guess what? I smirked, wiping my hands on a rag. What's that? He leaned in, eyes wide, like he was delivering the biggest piece of news in the world. That doctor guy? He's gone. Just up and left. My dad says nobody's gonna miss him. I chuckled, tossing the rag onto a crate. Sounds about right. The kid grinned, clearly pleased with himself. Then his expression turned thoughtful. Did you ever get even with them? I looked down at him, watching the way he fidgeted, waiting for some big, dramatic answer. I took my time before I spoke. The desert takes care of its own. His brow furrowed. What's that mean? I patted his shoulder. Means people like them always dig their own graves. You just gotta give him time. He considered that, then nodded like it made perfect sense. Cool. That was the end of it. No more questions, no dragging it out. The kid had the right idea, learn the lesson, move on. That night, I sat on my porch watching the stars settle into the sky. The air was cool, the land stretching out in every direction, silent and steady. Some men would have let something like this break them, let it eat at them, let it turn them bitter. But I wasn't some men. I was still here. Still standing. Still me. I poured a drink, took a slow sip, and let the night settle in. In the desert, the weak don't survive. That's just the way it is.